Welcome back. Today we're going to be covering the book of Deuteronomy. And this book is one which I always thought as a kid growing up, when I came to read it, it was time to read, as I was reading through scriptures, I always thought that this is a dry book. Never really wanted to study Deuteronomy. I thought, okay, it's all been covered before, pretty much. So I didn't understand why they were rehashing and that sort of thing. Well, now I understand what's going on with the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to develop that and talk about that this actually is a covenant between God and his people. And so this restatement of the law, in fact, the name, today's name, Deuteronomy, second law, comes from the Septuagint title of the book, but in the Hebrew it is, and these are the words, and so these are the words of Moses. These are the words of the covenant. So basically, Deuteronomy is in the structure of a suzerainty covenant, and we'll come up with that again in a few minutes. But God is restating on the plains of Moab the issues and the stipulations of the covenant to them, between them and himself, between himself and them, and so reordering that or reiterating that to them, that this is the way things are to be. And so this becomes the standard for the rest of the Old Testament as far as how Israel is to act and how they are to interact with each other and have right relationship with God as far as a people. So, again, Deuteronomy's title, the second law. The author, again, is Moses. But, of course, modern scholars deny Mosaic authorship for the book of Deuteronomy. They say that it's much, much later, that it was created whole cloth by someone else around the time of Josiah at the end of the monarchy period. In fact, they would say that from Deuteronomy all the way through much of Kings was basically created by a Deuteronomist or Deuteronomistic school of writers that are bringing all of these things about and causing all these things to be written. And that would be then the impetus for Josiah's reform. Of course, I disagree with that, and conservative scholars will disagree with that. And Moses' authorship is attested 38 times by Moses himself in the book, in the third person, and continues to be affirmed again by Jesus and the apostles in Matthew 19, Mark 20, John 1, John 5, Acts 3, Romans 10, 1 Corinthians 9. So throughout the New Testament, Moses is presented as author, understood as author of this book. However, there are some later edits in the book, and that's one of the issues that scholars point to. And the later edits say, in the land or unto this day, things like that really are taking place, or edits that have a viewpoint from perspective of it being actually across the Jordan. If we look over here, Moses and the people of Israel are up here on the plain of Moab, and they're about to cross over. Of course, Moses isn't going to be crossing over, but this is where they're located, and the perspective at times of these edits is across the river, over from in this side. They've crossed the river, and it's over to the west of the Jordan River. And there's also the edits, or there's the account of Moses' death. Now, God could have told Moses, write this down. This is the account of your death, and this is what's going to happen. And then Moses went and died, and God did all those things. That's possible, because God does say at times to Moses, write this down. I don't think that's the case. I would hold someone after Moses, someone like Joshua, is perhaps writing these later edits, someone early, but that's my view, not everyone's view. But in any case, there are some later edits, and that does not distract or detract from the fact that Moses wrote this book. So in any case, that's the author. Now, the political occasion, this is as my friend Archie England calls it, a politics of no compromise. There's no compromise here as far as how the people are to act. They are to be God's people. They are to be his covenant people, and they are to act according to his covenant. No compromise. If not, then curses will fall upon them. But if they do, blessings will fall, and the land laid before them to a bountiful land, a land of peace and rest and fulfillment and plenty for them and for their children. The spiritual occasion, well, Moses again is preaching the law to the nation of Israel. Again, he's preaching this on, again, the plains of Moab, and he's exhorting them to observe this covenant with God. And underlying this covenant is the idea of land. The land is literally before them across the river, and they can smell the breezes coming from the ocean over the land and across the Jordan River to them, and so they can literally smell it. It is so close. The Jordan River itself, at this point, is about the time that they cross anyway, is at flood stage. So it's at places perhaps a mile wide. Normally, it's not much wider. Maybe a couple times wider than this map behind me. And it's just more like a very windy creek bed, maybe a deep creek bed, but that's normally it's in that sort of a channel, maybe 20 feet wide or so, and 20, 30 feet wide, and it just winds back and forth from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea, and it drops again from Sea of Galilee 600 feet below sea level to 1,300 feet below sea level at the Dead Sea, lowest place on earth that's not underwater. And so the spiritual occasion, again, the land is here before us. The land is our land. God has given it to us, but there's a stipulation to its tenure in the land, and that is to keep the covenant. So Moses is calling on the nation to recognize and to act and live according to God's covenant and to be aware of the penalties of that covenant. So he's preaching to them. This is a book of sermons. He talks about, of course, the Ten Commandments being in the ark. He is reciting the law from memory and expounding upon it. Again, the emphasis is also on the law here. And again, the land as God's provision and inheritance. This is about the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant of gifting the land. God has given it to Abraham and his descendants forever. The geographical occasion, I've already mentioned, they're on the plains of Moab, just east of the Promised Land. They have been victorious over the Og, king of Bashan, and Sihon, as well in this region just east of the Dead Sea, and also over the Midianites, who have tried to corrupt them through sexual immorality and the whole Balaam issue and that sort of thing. The date, if you go with the early date, as I do, then the date would be around February, March, somewhere around that time, February, March of 1405 BC. And so this would be the time frame. The purpose of this book, again, is to restate the covenant to the people. And if they break the covenant, they're going to lose this land and be kicked out of it. Amos, the prophet, warns the northern tribes much later on, of this pending disaster that they're going to be kicked out of the land because of their sin. And he says to them, he cries out, "Prepare to meet your God." So this is what he's calling back to, is this Deuteronomic covenant of land tenure. If you keep the law, you'll be blessed, and you'll stay in the land and have plenty. And if you don't keep the law, you're going to be kicked out of the land, and you'll have curses upon you. So this is what Moses is preaching about, and this is what the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy is, to remind the people of the covenant and its blessings and curses that are hanging over their head. God is ready and willing to bless them, but he's also ready and willing to hold back the rain, to hold back the plenty and good, and to have them kicked out of the land if they don't follow him. Some key verses in the book, chapter 6, verses 4 and following, the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and with all your might." And so that is one of the key verses, this cry of covenant faithfulness, that God is Israel's God. Chapter 7, 9 through 10 is another key verse. "Know therefore that the Lord your God," that's Yahweh your God, He is God, the faithful God, who keeps his covenant and his loving kindness to 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commandments, but repays those who hate him to their faces to destroy them. He will not delay with him who hates him. He will repay him to his face. So this is not a lingering or patient God with those who hate him, but he will destroy those who hate him. And he will show his covenant faithfulness. In fact, loving kindness is this term chesed, and it actually means covenant faithfulness. It's the idea of God's going to keep his word of all the blessings and the loving kindness then of keeping his covenant to them, to 1,000 generations of those who love him. So God will bless them and their posterity for those who love him. Chapter 10, verses 12 through 13. Now Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you but to fear the Lord, Yahweh your God, to walk in all his ways and love him, and to serve Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today for your good. So these are given, these statutes are given not for capriciousness, not just because of God's whim. They are so that they will be blessed, they will be holy, and that God can live in their midst. So also another key verse, chapter 30, verse 19 and 20. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life. You thought that was a t-shirt, didn't you? So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord Yahweh, your God, by obeying his voice and by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord Yahweh swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. You can see that he uses the name or the title Lord, but that is actually quite a bit here, and that is actually Yahweh's covenant personal name. And that is invoked when in the instances where Scripture is talking about covenant God, covenant faithfulness, the fact that we have a covenantal relationship with God, that we can rely on him and he expects things of us. We have a covenant with him. It's not just like we're walking up and he doesn't know who we are. We have a covenant relationship. He is in obligation to us. We are in obligation to him. So, key chapters then, perhaps chapter 27, the ratification of the covenant, since we're talking about covenant throughout. Chapter 8 talks about the riches of God's divine provision. Chapter 28 talks about the blessings, so those are significant as well. We have, as far as concepts that are covered in the book. In chapter 4, we have the giving of the law, a restatement of that. We have the restatement of the covenant also in chapter 4. We have the past slavery that Israel was involved in, which God delivered them from, talked about in chapter 5. We have God's great deliverance, again, in chapter 7. His divine leadership and provision in chapter 8. Israel's past sins talked about in chapter 9. Divine judgments talked about in chapter 24. The past days talked about in chapter 32. The theological theme of the first 4 books are really covered here. They're all covered here in this book. There are 259 references to the previous 4 books from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So this book has a significant amount of what's called intertextuality. That's where Scripture quotes Scripture. And so he's referring to these, he's quoting them or referring to them. And he's also presenting love, holiness, and the justice of God within this book. And this book then, as I said, becomes the standard for theological doctrine, the standard for behavior and action, for faith and practice for the rest of the Old Testament. This is it. This is the book. So I used to think that this is just an old dry book. No, this is the standard upon which everyone is judged. The prophets call everyone back to Deuteronomy, to this type of relationship. The kings are evaluated. The people are evaluated against Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomic standard. So throughout the rest of the Old Testament history, this is the rule upon which everyone is measured. So it's a very important book, and most texts of the Old Testament are going to refer back to this book. So if you're going to preach the Old Testament, you should know something know something very good about, a good amount about this book of Deuteronomy. There's also this retribution principle talked about here, and we'll talk about this in Job, but the basic retribution principle is, the righteous are blessed, the wicked are cursed. And conversely, if you see someone who's cursed, he's probably wicked. If you see someone who's blessed, he's probably righteous. That's where we get, but that last viewpoint, as I mentioned, is actually wrong. But the fact that the righteous are blessed and the wicked cursed, that's generally true. But we also know that we've seen those who are righteous being afflicted. We've seen those who are wicked being successful, and that's borne out in the book of Job. Sometimes these things take place under the patience of God. Sometimes these things take place under or for the reason of teaching and instruction, so that Job might learn something about God and learn to trust in him more, and that we might learn more about God, and his friends might learn that their views of God were wrong, and that they might be brought into a closer relationship with God as well. So this retribution principle is here, and it is true, but in specific instances it's not always holding true. So we'll see that again as we move along in Job. And David talks about this, his afflictions and that sort of thing, but he's always in the book of Psalms, but then he talks about how God delivers and he's faithful anyway. Key peoples here, Lord, Yahweh, Moses, Joshua. In this book, there's all sorts of literary features. There's farewell speech of Moses, sermons that he preaches. Deuteronomy exhorts the people encourages them to act correctly. There's all sorts of persuasive speech, chiasms, inclusios, repetition, parallelisms, rhetoric. In other words, Moses is speaking rhetorically, not rhetorically as we think of a rhetorical question, but he's speaking with persuasive speech. Rhetoric is not a bad thing. It's just that we're speaking to persuade. And everyone has rhetoric. I have rhetoric as I'm speaking to you right now. And rhetoric is not a bad thing. It's just the fact that there are certain forms and ways in which we try to influence people through speech. And that's what he's doing here. He's using rhetoric, right rhetoric, but he's still using rhetoric. There's this whole issue of the suzerainty covenant in the ancient Near East. A suzerain is an overking, a high king, or a king of an empire. And he comes up upon a city or a smaller people group, and he conquers them. And then he imposes his covenant upon them and says, this is the way it's going to be, and you're going to keep this covenant or I'll wipe you out. And they willingly say, all right, we'll keep the covenant. We'll be your servants. We'll be your people. And so the Deuteronomy is an imposed suzerainty covenant. God is imposing his covenant upon the people. Now, at Sinai, the people already decided to accept this relationship. And so then once they accepted the relationship, God imposed the covenant. And so this was a voluntary basis, but they volunteered to do this, and now that they are in this relationship, they can't get out. They are his people. And so Deuteronomy is one of these. It's structured as one of these ancient Near Eastern treaty structures, a suzerainty treaty structure. And so there are parts to this. There's a preamble where the speaker is introduced, Moses is introduced. A historical prologue is next, where it talks about the past and how these got together. There are stipulations of the covenant. The people are supposed to do this, this, and this. And the suzerain will perhaps do that as well, but there are stipulations. And then there's a statement concerning the document itself as far as how it's to be dealt with and how it should be kept. And then there are witnesses presented, and then there are blessings and curses presented. And these are the parts that you'll find in a suzerainty treaty structure. And so they're all there. And Kenneth Kitchen is an archaeologist and linguist, and he has studied treaties in the ancient Near East. And he has this preamble for Deuteronomy being Deuteronomy 1 through 5. So you might want to write these things down. In this, the preamble, God says, as suzerain, he says, I'm your God, basically. And so you have this preamble. Also in Exodus, this is also happening, the same suzerainty treaty structure is also present in Exodus 20, verse 2, where God says, I am your God. But in any case, the preamble, Deuteronomy 1 through 5. Historical prologue is where the suzerain tells the historical background for the treaty and tells of the benevolence that he has toward the people. He's delivered Israel. He's bought them for a price. He's brought them out under mighty judgments. And this historical prologue of God's deliverance obligates the vassal, that's the Israelites, to gratitude and to follow God. Deuteronomy 1:6 through 4:49 is the historical prologue. Stipulations. This is where the suzerain imposes conditions and requires an oath of loyalty. That's Deuteronomy 5 through 11, chapters 5 through 11. The preservation and public proclamation of the covenant, Deuteronomy 12 through 26. This is where copies of the covenant are preserved for both parties, both for the suzerain and the vassal, and are read publicly by the vassal once per year. This is the two tablets. It's not that you have five commandments and 5 commandments. There are 2 copies of the 10 commandments. They can both, because of the way Hebrew is written, they could both be found on probably a very small document, very small tablet. Doesn't have to be a large thing. In any case, there's 2 copies. One copy of the suzerain covenant that goes in the copy of the suzerain, the high king's temple, and one is supposed to go in the vassal king's temple. Well, guess what? The suzerain and vassal, or the suzerain is God, and the vassal people, their temple is one and the same. So both copies go into the Ark of the Covenant. So that's why there's 2 tablets. It's not like when Mel Brooks says, I bring you the 10 commandments. No, it's not like that. There's 10, and they're each on one. All 10 are on both of those tablets. Then there's the witnesses to the treaty. Deuteronomy 27 presents this. The suzerain and vassal each invoke their gods, and in this case it's Yahweh God, as witness to the treaty. And then sanctions. The treaty lists blessings for obedience and curses for the one who breaks the treaty. Deuteronomy 28, 31, 32. These sanctions are woven. Blessings and curses are woven throughout there. Now, Kenneth Kitchen, again, looked at this structure, and as he compared this structure with other ancient Near Eastern treaties, found that this suzerainty treaty fits the later Hittite treaty structure, suzerainty treaty structure, from the late 2nd millennium BC. So from around 1400 to 1000 BC, somewhere in that time frame. He might say it's a little later, but in that time frame, the treaty in Exodus, the whole book of Deuteronomy, and there's one in Joshua, repetition of this treaty structure in Joshua as well. They all fit that Hittite treaty. They don't fit with earlier treaties, and they don't fit with later treaties that some Assyriologists and others want to impose upon the text. So that's really the content of the book. It's covering that treaty. All those things are there. And as far as some special contributions for the book, we'll be back with that in the next video.